Look at this man. A highly decorated U.S. general stepped off his helicopter in Vietnam ready to spit fire and throw men in military prison. He expected to see undisciplined soldiers. Instead, what walked out of the jungle to meet him made his blood run cold. They smelled like rotting fish. They were wearing black pajamas and enemy uniforms, and they were holding sawed-off Soviet machine guns that no American armory had ever seen. The general was absolutely disgusted. He opened his mouth to end their careers right there on the landing pad, but within seconds, these filthy, terrifying men handed him something that made him shut his mouth, turn around, and fly away. Who were these absolute savages, and why was the Pentagon so terrified of them that the U.S. government officially swore they did not exist? We're talking about a unit so lethal, so deeply classified, that if they were captured, Washington would look the world in the eye and say, "We have no idea who those men are." They were the ghosts of the jungle, the men who threw away their M16s, ignored every rule in the Big Army playbook, and made the Viet Cong believe they were hunting demons. You think you know the history of the Vietnam War? You've only been fed the sanitized Hollywood version. Today, we are ripping the lid off the most classified, brutal, and downright insane Special Operations Unit America ever sent into the dark. Stick around until the very end, because the psychological warfare trick they use to mentally break the enemy is going to blow your mind. Let's get into it. Imagine being handed a loaded weapon, dropped into a completely unauthorized combat zone, and explicitly told by your own government that if you fall, you never even existed. This is not a paranoid Hollywood script or a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. This is the absolute bone-chilling reality of the most terrifying and deeply hidden military cover-up of the 20th century. American politicians constructed a phantom unit so ruthless and so completely off the books that even the highest-ranking combat generals were kept entirely in the dark about its true nature. These men were forged into a weapon of absolute destruction, yet they were deliberately hidden behind a wall of bureaucratic lies so thick it took decades to crack. The brilliant architects of this deception began their work by engineering a name designed specifically to put anyone who heard it straight to sleep. Officially, this terrifying syndicate of lethal professionals was called the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. Say that out loud, and notice how spectacularly boring it sounds. There were absolutely no academic studies being conducted, and nobody was quietly observing anything except the terrified final moments of their adversaries. This linguistic masterpiece of camouflage was crafted precisely to make enemy intelligence analysts toss intercepted documents directly into the garbage without a second glance. This strategy of utter boredom worked flawlessly, hiding the most dangerous men on the planet under the ridiculous guise of innocent administrative clerks. While the enemy was frantically scanning the horizon for heavily armored conventional forces, these phantom operatives were silently rewriting the entire playbook of modern warfare. It was a staggering masterclass in misdirection that successfully kept the explosive truth hidden from the very taxpayers who were unknowingly funding it. But this clever manipulation of words was merely the opening act of a much more scandalous and profound institutional betrayal. In shocking reality, this ultra-secret unit was formally established on the 24th of January, 1964, bypassing every standard military protocol in existence. What makes this story so incredibly scandalous is the terrifying level of absolute independence these shadows were granted by the highest authorities. They did not answer to the legendary General William Westmoreland, the man who supposedly commanded every single American soldier in the entire combat theater. This blatant, unapologetic disregard for the established chain of command drove regular Army officers into states of absolute, sputtering fury whenever they encountered these rogue operators. Instead of reporting to local base commanders, the leaders of this phantom group took their orders straight from the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the nation's capital. They operated under a highly classified, ultra-restricted directive known strictly as Operational Plan 34 Alpha. The sheer, staggering scale and unbelievable audacity of this mandate remain completely shocking to military historians even today. Washington politicians demanded impossible results from these men, but conveniently refused to take any public responsibility for the deeply unconventional methods required to achieve them. These powerful bureaucrats wanted a surgical, invisible tool to handle their darkest problems, but they demanded complete plausible deniability if anything went wrong. This toxic political hypocrisy meant that the greatest warriors the nation had ever produced were treated like dirty secrets by their own leaders. Their absolute freedom from conventional military regulations made them unbelievably effective, but it simultaneously made them the most legally unprotected men in the entire theater. However, the true horror of their situation becomes apparent only when you understand the absolute nightmare of their primary operational directive. These elite operatives utilized a very specific, bone-chilling slang term for their most hazardous deployments, simply referring to it as crossing the fence. Those three little words carried an unimaginable weight of institutional risk and demanded a level of personal bravery that totally defies human comprehension. Crossing the fence meant illegally leaving the boundaries of South Vietnam and stepping deep into the sovereign, heavily guarded territories of Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. It was a massive, calculated violation of international borders that could have easily ignited a global political catastrophe if their covert presence was ever publicly exposed. The sheer scandal of this terrifying reality becomes crystal clear when you remember the solemn promises made to the American public during those turbulent years. President Lyndon Johnson stood before television cameras, looked straight into the eyes of millions of citizens, and absolutely swore that no American boys were fighting in Laos. It was a spectacular, flawlessly delivered political lie built on a deeply disturbing technicality crafted by the sharpest legal minds in the intelligence community. From the twisted perspective of Washington lawyers, the president was not technically lying, because the men sent into those jungles were completely stripped of their American identities. Before these incredible professionals vanished into the dense, unforgiving wilderness, they were subjected to a ruthless, systematic erasure of their entire existence. They went through a mandatory, deeply humiliating sanitization process that stripped away every single piece of evidence connecting them to the United States. This was not a simple change of clothing. It was the methodical destruction of their personal histories, transforming them into literal, living phantoms. They were entirely disconnected from the proud nation they were fiercely swearing to protect with their last breath. But the heartbreaking, maddening details of this identity purge reveal a level of government paranoia that is truly hard to stomach. Operatives were strictly forced to hand over their metal dog tags, the sacred identification plates that carried their names, blood types, and religious affiliations. Their military identification cards were completely confiscated by stone-faced security officers at the forward operating bases, leaving them with absolutely nothing to prove who they were. The institutional paranoia ran so incredibly deep that even personal photographs of their wives, children, and parents were strictly forbidden and locked away in heavy steel safes. If a soldier possessed a lucky Zippo lighter with an American unit crest, or even standard-issue green military underwear, it was ruthlessly confiscated before they boarded the chopper. In place of their proud military heritage, these men were handed flawlessly forged cover stories that insulted their incredible training and enormous personal sacrifice. They were instructed to claim they were merely civilian contractors, working for entirely fictional corporations that existed only on counterfeit government stationery. It was an elaborate, bulletproof wall of deceit, designed entirely to protect the careers of politicians sitting safely thousands of miles away from the danger. These fearless men knew exactly what this meant. If disaster struck during a mission, they were entirely on their own, completely abandoned by the massive system they served. The contingency plan drafted by the Pentagon for a scenario where an operative was captured was nothing short of a sickening, heartbreaking betrayal. If one of these heroes was badly wounded and fell into enemy hands, the official government response was already typed up and waiting in a locked file cabinet. Washington spokesmen were explicitly instructed to look the global press in the eye and coldly state that they had absolutely no record of this individual ever serving the country. They would categorically, aggressively, deny that the captive had ever worked for any branch of the United States government or any specialized intelligence agency. This staggering institutional betrayal led to psychological consequences that completely altered the mindset of these terrifying jungle warriors. To the official world, a captured hero instantly transformed into a delusion, a rogue traveler who had foolishly wandered into a hostile zone by his own absurd mistake. Every single operator boarding those unmarked helicopters understood clearly that their own flag would absolutely disown them in their most desperate hour of need. They were carrying out the most vital intelligence missions of the decade, yet they accepted that their reward for a fatal tragedy would be absolute erasure from history. This required a breed of psychological resilience that regular infantrymen back at the main bases could never even begin to comprehend or replicate. Cast out from the protective embrace of the regular army, these phantoms were forced to operate under conditions that would completely shatter an ordinary mind. They could not simply grab a radio and scream for standard air support or beg for a medical evacuation chopper when a firefight went critical. Any loud call for help would instantly expose their illegal presence across the border and trigger the exact international incident Washington was absolutely terrified of. They were completely isolated, relying strictly on their own savage instincts and the unbreakable bond they shared with the men walking right beside them. This extreme isolation forged them into a terrifyingly efficient collective organism, capable of outsmarting overwhelming odds in an environment that desperately wanted them gone. They learned to move like silent shadows, blending into the hostile landscape and striking targets with a ferocity that left the enemy completely paralyzed with fear. Because they were unbound by standard military doctrine, they developed unconventional, highly aggressive tactics that the traditional generals found utterly disgusting and barbaric. Their forced detachment from the rulebook made them the undisputed masters of covert warfare, setting a standard that remains totally unmatched in modern history. However, the most mind-bending paradox of all was how the high command secretly reacted to the unbelievable results these ghosts were delivering on a daily basis. Despite being treated like dirty secrets and stripped of their basic military dignity, these nameless warriors consistently brought back the most critical intelligence of the entire era. They disappeared into hostile territory for days at a time, surviving on sheer willpower, only to return with data that saved countless conventional lives across the massive theater. The stiff, regulation-obsessed generals absolutely despised their scruffy appearance and their blatant disregard for the rules, but they absolutely depended on the information they gathered. It was a painfully ironic situation where the most disrespected, unrecognized men were secretly running the entire intelligence show from the deepest, darkest shadows. Every successful extraction was a massive, unspoken insult to the giant, wealthy, and incredibly loud conventional army that struggled desperately to match their success. While massive battalions stumbled blindly through the forests, making tremendous noise, these tiny teams of phantoms were silently mapping out the enemy's deepest secrets. The regular army commanders had to clench their teeth, swallow their immense pride, and accept the lifelines thrown to them by men who officially did not even exist on paper. It was a bitter pill for the military establishment to swallow, proving unequivocally that true effectiveness often lies far outside the rigid boundaries of official approval. The enemy forces were also rapidly catching on to the horrifying reality that a new, terrifying breed of opponent was stalking their secure zones. Finding the invisible traces of these covert teams, the hostile commanders were thrown into states of absolute panic and frantic confusion. The total lack of standard uniforms or identification led the adversary to spin wild, deeply superstitious tales about who was actually hunting them in the pitch blackness. The massive deception designed to fool the American public had accidentally birthed a psychological weapon that was severely fracturing the enemy's morale from the inside out. But the ultimate price paid by these invisible operators remains one of the most tragic and infuriating chapters of this entire unbelievable saga. When one of these magnificent specialists met a tragic end behind enemy lines, there were absolutely no glorious military funerals or public honors waiting for them at home. Their grieving families never received a beautiful folded flag or a poignant speech from a high-ranking official detailing their incredible bravery and dedication to the cause. Instead, loved ones were handed vague, incredibly cold letters stating their son or husband was lost under completely unexplained and deliberately obscured circumstances. The geographical location of the tragedy was almost always heavily censored or entirely fabricated to maintain the precious, fragile government lie. These unbelievable heroes, who endured the most punishing conditions imaginable, were quietly swept under the rug of history to protect the political careers of terrified bureaucrats. They were reduced to mere statistical anomalies, their immense sacrifices buried under towering mountains of classified paperwork and counterfeit civilian contracts. It was an agonizing, monumental injustice, a heavy toll willingly paid by men who valued the mission far more than they valued public recognition or shiny medals. They accepted this raw deal with their eyes wide open, becoming the silent guardians of a nation that completely refused to acknowledge their unmatched heroism. Can you even begin to fathom the sheer mental fortitude required to operate under such profoundly unfair and manipulative conditions on a daily basis? These unparalleled professionals were not just fighting a highly trained adversary in the sweltering heat. They were simultaneously fighting the massive bureaucratic machinery of their own nation. Every single mission was a terrifying tightrope walk over an abyss of total oblivion, with absolutely zero safety nets provided by the country they loved. If they succeeded, the politicians secretly celebrated and took all the credit. But if they failed, their memory was instantly tossed into the incinerator of classified history. The incredible lengths to which the Pentagon went to maintain this ridiculous facade bordered on absolute clinical insanity. They employed entire departments of intelligence officers whose sole job was to fabricate paperwork, falsify logs, and ensure that the phantom operatives remained completely undetectable. It was a massive multi-million-dollar industry of deceit, built explicitly to protect the delicate sensibilities of the viewing public back home. The American people were sitting in their comfortable living rooms, watching sanitized news reports, while these nameless men were enduring unimaginable horrors in foreign jungles. But the most scandalous piece of this intricate puzzle was how the operators themselves actually viewed their bizarre, ghostly status. Shockingly, instead of breaking under the immense pressure of government betrayal, these elite fighters embraced their dark reality with a terrifying, aggressive enthusiasm. They forged an unbreakable brotherhood out of their shared abandonment, realizing that they were the only people on Earth who truly understood what was actually happening. Their absolute isolation from the regular army became their greatest source of immense pride, fueling a rebellious culture that made them even more lethal. They knew they were the absolute best, and the fact that they were strictly off the books only proved exactly how vital they really were to the war effort. Whenever a team prepared to cross the fence, the atmosphere on the base was thick with a heavy, unspoken realization of the massive stakes involved. Men silently checked their modified weapons, tightened their gear, and looked into the eyes of their brothers, knowing that the country they served had already officially forgotten them. There were no rousing speeches from commanding officers, no patriotic music playing in the background, just the grim, silent preparation of men going to work in absolute hell. They stepped onto those blacked-out helicopters as complete non-entities, ready to unleash absolute destruction on an enemy that had absolutely no idea what was coming. As the choppers lifted off and vanished into the thick, humid night, the true magnitude of the operation settled over the base like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The officials in Washington could print as many denial forms as they wanted, and the president could tell as many televised lies as he pleased. But out there, in the suffocating darkness of the forbidden zones, the terrifying reality of the Studies and Observations Group was written in fire and total chaos. They were the undeniable, terrifying truth that the government tried desperately to hide, and their silenced voices still scream through the pages of history today. The staggering reality of this secret war hit the highest levels of the Pentagon like a physical blow when the actual statistics were finally placed on the table. Why did the strict, regulation-obsessed military machine tolerate these rogue, unkempt phantoms who openly mocked every rule in the book? The answer lies in a set of cold, hard numbers that completely humiliated the standard operating procedures of the mighty American military. At their absolute peak in the late 1960s, this classified group consisted of roughly 2,000 men, which included both American operatives and their fierce indigenous partners. This tiny, scattered collection of warriors represented less than 1% of the total United States military presence in the entire Southeast Asian theater. Yet, this microscopic fraction of the fighting force was single-handedly responsible for an absolute intelligence miracle that defied all logical explanation. Those 2,000 men, operating deep behind hostile lines, generated a staggering 75% of all actionable intelligence regarding the legendary Ho Chi Minh Trail. Think about the sheer magnitude of that achievement for a moment. An army of hundreds of thousands of conventional troops, backed by billion-dollar satellites, high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, and massive signal interception stations, was essentially blind without them. Every major bombing campaign, every devastating ambush on supply convoys, and every targeted airstrike relied almost entirely on the data brought back by teams of just 6 or 7 exhausted men walking out of the jungle. But those astonishing numbers were only the surface of a much deeper, more fundamental clash of military cultures. To truly understand why these operatives looked and acted like wild men, you have to compare them to the standard forces they were leaving behind. Picture a typical American infantry platoon hacking its way through the dense Vietnamese highlands in 1968. 30 heavily burdened men lumbered through the unforgiving brush, carrying massive packs, steel helmets, heavy machine guns, and enough clanking equipment to supply a small fortress. They moved through the delicate ecosystem of the jungle the way a massive, out-of-control garbage truck violently crashes through a quiet city center. Their boots sucked loudly in the mud, their machetes aggressively hacked at thick vines, and they constantly swatted at insects, announcing their clumsy presence to every living creature within 500 meters. The jungle reacted to these conventional forces the exact same way a healthy human body aggressively fights off a toxic bacterial infection. The environment resisted them, tormented them, and made a constant, low-grade effort to violently expel the noisy foreign objects from its territory. Now completely erase that image from your mind and picture a phantom reconnaissance team slipping through that exact same hostile terrain. These men did not fight the jungle. They completely surrendered to it, becoming as much as humanly possible an invisible part of the terrifying landscape itself. This absolute dedication to invisibility required a preparation process so extreme that regular Army officers openly questioned the operatives' sanity. Days before crossing the border, these men stopped using standard American military soap, a simple act that meant the absolute difference between survival and a horrific tragedy. The chemical scent of Western soap, completely imperceptible to a normal person, could be instantly detected by a highly trained enemy point man up to 200 meters away on a still breeze. They stopped smoking completely, entirely abandoned their standard issue rations, and violently shifted their body's chemistry by consuming only local pungent diets. In a move that absolutely sickened visiting generals, these elite warriors intentionally rubbed fermented fish sauce into their skin and clothing until they smelled exactly like the enemy they were hunting. They willingly embraced this repulsive stench because surviving meant smelling like the forest, smelling like the locals, and smelling absolutely nothing like an American soldier. But smelling like the enemy was only the first shocking step in a complete violent rejection of standard military doctrine. The absolute heresy that truly drove the high command into a frenzy was the unit's blatant, unapologetic rejection of the standard-issue American weaponry. The M16 rifle was the absolute pride of the conventional army, yet these elite operators frequently tossed it aside like a piece of useless scrap metal. In the suffocating, dirty confines of the jungle, the early M16s jammed with a terrifying frequency, and these men simply refused to trust their lives to an unreliable machine. But more importantly, when you are operating deep in forbidden territory, the distinct sharp crack of an American rifle is an instant, fatal giveaway to every hostile patrol in the sector. Instead, these shadows deliberately armed themselves with the enemy's own Soviet-made AK-47 assault rifles, carrying them with such terrifying consistency that it became their visual signature. If a hostile battalion commander heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of an AK-47 firing in the distance, his brain would automatically assume it was his own men engaging a target. That brief, crucial moment of enemy hesitation, those few seconds of psychological confusion, was the razor-thin margin these teams used to launch a devastating ambush or execute a flawless extraction. They were not just carrying weapons. They were master craftsmen actively modifying their lethal tools to manipulate the auditory battlefield. This aggressive, rebellious ingenuity reached its absolute peak with their shocking, highly illegal modifications to the Soviet RPD light machine gun. The standard RPD was a brutal weapon, but its long barrel made it incredibly awkward to swing around in the split-second close-quarters chaos of a deep jungle firefight. The operative's solution was savagely direct and completely irreversible. They simply took hacksaws and violently chopped the barrels down to half their original length. This horrific butchery created a weapon that would give any traditional armorer a massive heart attack, completely destroying its long-range ballistic profile. But at distances under 20 meters, where these terrifying jungle engagements were exclusively decided, that sawed-off nightmare functioned with an absolutely devastating, flesh-shredding efficiency. Their blatant disrespect for the rules extended directly to the unauthorized, heavily customized clothing they wore into the darkest zones. You would never catch these men wearing the standard, neat, olive-drab uniforms that made regular soldiers stand out like bright green targets in the dappled sunlight. They purchased illegal tiger-stripe camouflage from shady black market dealers in Saigon, utilizing its jagged, chaotic patterns to completely visually dissolve into the chaotic background of the rainforest. Some went even further, terrifyingly donning the black pajamas of the local peasants or, in extreme, highly dangerous cases, wearing partial uniforms stripped directly from the bodies of the North Vietnamese army. Yet beneath the shocking uniforms and the hacked-up weapons lay a psychological discipline that was far more lethal than any bullet. The greatest weapon these men possessed was not strapped to their chests. It was an absolute terrifying mastery of total silence. A standard reconnaissance team operating deep behind the lines utilized communication protocols that would seem completely alien, even supernatural, to a conventional infantryman. For hours, sometimes days on end, the entire unit would move through the sweltering heat without a single man making a voluntary sound or whispering a single syllable. They communicated entirely through a highly complex, lightning-fast language of hand signals, perfectly adapted to the deadly high-stakes grammar of jungle combat. This culture of extreme silence required a level of psychological endurance that actively broke the minds of highly qualified men during the brutal selection process. They did not just recruit physically tough soldiers, they actively hunted for a rare, specific breed of psychopath who could remain absolutely still while their sensory inputs screamed in panic. If a bird suddenly stopped singing high in the canopy, these men instantly froze in place, treating that tiny absence of sound with the exact same terror as the sharp click of an enemy rifle being cocked. They would lie motionless in the mud, insects crawling over their eyeballs, waiting 4 agonizing hours for the natural ambient noise of the forest to return. To an untrained ear, the midnight jungle is just a chaotic, terrifying cacophony of random noises. But to these phantoms, it was a massive, flowing database of actionable intelligence. They learned that the sudden splash of a specific species of frog meant deep, concealable water was nearby, and the sudden silence of local insects meant a human patrol was moving exactly 400 meters to their left. They were not just surviving the environment, they were actively downloading it, processing every tiny detail with a cold, calculating precision that kept them alive against impossible odds. This was a level of lethal, paranoid perfection that the loud, blundering regular army simply could not comprehend, and it terrified them to their very core. The absolute terror these phantoms inflicted on the enemy was so profound that it took decades for historians to fully understand the psychological damage they caused. When military researchers finally gained access to the highly classified, desperately guarded archives of the North Vietnamese Army, they found documents that read more like horror stories than tactical military reports. The enemy forces did not refer to these covert operatives as standard American soldiers or specialized reconnaissance units. In their frantic internal communications, the hostile commanders gave them terrifying mythological names, whispering about the mad dogs or the horrifying painted faces who stalked the shadows. The tone of these newly discovered enemy documents was not the calm, analytical language of professional soldiers discussing a rival tactical force. It was the frantic, panicked language of deeply terrified men trying to describe something they fundamentally believed was not entirely human. Enemy officers constantly reported waking up in heavily fortified, heavily guarded base camps to find their equipment completely rearranged and their secure perimeters effortlessly breached. They found clear, undeniable evidence that invisible intruders had walked right past their elite sentries, manipulated their gear, and vanished without snapping a single twig or triggering a single tripwire. But the psychological warfare these men waged went far beyond simply sneaking around in the dark to steal documents. These ruthless operatives were aggressively trained to exploit the deepest, darkest cultural superstitions and folk religious fears of the local combatants. They understood that an enemy who believes he is being actively hunted by vengeful jungle spirits is an enemy whose combat effectiveness has already been completely destroyed. The most horrifying and legendary tactic they employed was the strategic, bone-chilling placement of the ace of spades, universally recognized in the region as an absolute symbol of looming tragedy. Imagine the sheer, heart-stopping terror of a highly trained North Vietnamese sentry waking up from a brief nap to find that fatal playing card resting gently on his chest. The psychological devastation caused by waking up and realizing an invisible killer was close enough to touch your sleeping face, yet chose to leave a warning card instead, was absolutely catastrophic. captured enemy reports documented entire platoons suffering from what their own translators desperately called a complete dissolution of unit confidence and morale. The hostile soldiers stopped sleeping, compulsively checked their perimeters every 5 minutes, and began whispering terrifying rumors about American ghost soldiers who could literally walk through solid walls. This incredibly subtle, deeply cruel form of psychological torture was completely incomprehensible to the loud, aggressive generals of the regular United States Army, who only understood massive bombing raids. Yet this terrifying mastery of the jungle was only possible because of a shocking cultural transformation that the standard military found deeply offensive. While the enormous conventional army generally treated the indigenous mountain tribes of the Central Highlands with barely concealed contempt, these elite operators did something completely unthinkable. They did not just hire the fiercely independent Montagnard tribesmen as simple guides. They literally abandoned their own Western civilization to become true brothers in blood and spirit. These highly trained American warriors spent years living in remote, isolated villages, completely immersing themselves in an ancient culture that the formal military establishment considered primitive and useless. They did not just learn a few basic phrases to give orders, they mastered the complex tribal dialects fluently enough to argue ancient theology, crack dark jokes, and even propose marriage. The level of integration these operators achieved was so profound and absolute that it completely shattered the rigid, hierarchical minds of visiting staff officers. These Americans willingly participated in sacred, highly secretive rituals, drinking warm rice wine and accepting permanent, painful scarification markings across their bodies. In the most extreme, highly documented cases, these incredible warriors even underwent the agonizing ritual of having their teeth physically filed down to points, a brutal requirement for entering the highest echelons of the tribal warrior society. They wore heavy brass bracelets signifying their newfound tribal allegiance, looking completely indistinguishable from the fierce native fighters they lived and bled alongside. This total cultural surrender created a bond of absolute fanatical loyalty that no amount of military rank, threatening paperwork, or government money could ever hope to buy. When a polished, arrogant colonel from the regional command arrived at a highland village to bark orders, the local fighters simply stared at him with cold, polite incomprehension. But when a filthy, unshaven American sergeant wearing unauthorized tiger-stripe camouflage and tribal bracelets spoke softly, an entire army of the most lethal jungle fighters on Earth moved as one synchronized machine. The authority these operators wielded was not printed on a government document. It was forged in shared suffering, mutual respect, and the incredible act of carrying each other's wounded bodies through a hail of enemy gunfire. This true brotherhood was the ultimate living refutation of everything the rigid, massive American military machine believed about how wars were supposed to be fought and won. The bureaucratic backlash against this incredible success was as predictable as it was utterly, hopelessly pathetic. The military establishment simply could not intellectually handle the existence of men who broke every single rule, yet continuously delivered the absolute best results of the entire conflict. They responded the only way a giant, mindless bureaucracy knows how, by drowning the operators in a relentless, suffocating flood of formal reprimands, surprise inspections, and aggressive disciplinary threats. The inspectors wrote furious, panicked reports about unauthorized weapons, non-standard uniforms, and missing personnel files, sending massive stacks of angry memos up the chain of command. But the absolute futility of this paperwork war was beautifully exposed during one legendary, highly documented confrontation at a forward operating base. A furious visiting colonel from the Inspector General's office cornered a highly decorated team commander who had just returned from a brutal 12-day survival mission across the border. The furious bureaucrat dramatically unfurled a massive, meticulously typed list detailing 17 specific uniform and equipment violations he had observed on the base. The elite commander listened in absolute silence, then calmly reached into his filthy pack and slammed a highly classified targeting package down on the table right in front of the stunned inspector. It contained the exact coordinates, photographs, and troop dispositions for a massive, heavily guarded North Vietnamese logistics hub that his team had just miraculously mapped out. The silent message delivered in that tense, suffocating room was absolutely devastating and completely undeniable. The commander coldly informed the bureaucrat that the window to launch a devastating airstrike and save hundreds of American lives was rapidly closing in a matter of mere hours. The pristine staff officer looked at the world-changing intelligence package, slowly looked back down at his pathetic list of 17 uniform violations, and quietly asked what time the next helicopter was leaving for Saigon. When the lives of thousands of regular soldiers depended entirely on the raw data these phantom warriors dragged out of the darkness, all the threatening disciplinary paperwork was immediately and quietly tossed into the nearest incinerator. They were untouchable on the battlefield, protected by the undeniable fact that they were the only men capable of doing the impossible. But the ultimate heartbreaking tragedy of this incredible unit is that their greatest enemy was not the hostile army, but the crushing silence of their own nation's history. Because the government officially denied their missions ever took place, the doctrine of plausible deniability followed these magnificent warriors all the way back home to their civilian lives. When the war finally ended, they could not be publicly honored with the massive parades, shining medals, or presidential speeches they so desperately deserved. They were forced to lock their incredible stories away in the darkest corners of their minds, living as invisible men among a society that had absolutely no idea what they had sacrificed. Even decades later, when these aging veterans finally began to cautiously whisper the truth about their service, the general public completely refused to believe them. Their stories of crossing forbidden borders, executing flawless psychological warfare, and becoming tribal warlords sounded like the wildly exaggerated plots of cheap Hollywood action movies. It wasn't until the late 1990s, when the heavy steel doors of the classified archives were finally forced open, that the shocking, undeniable documents proved every single word they had ever spoken was the absolute truth. The targeting packages, the terrified enemy reports about the painted faces, and the stunning casualty statistics finally dragged their incredible legacy out into the light. Yet, despite the belated proof, these men ultimately faded away exactly as they had operated in those sweltering jungles, as absolute, undeniable phantoms, leaving behind a massive, world-altering impact while remaining entirely invisible to the world they fought so hard to protect.